Bem-vindos a Inteligências Lúdicas, meu nome é Rodrigo Manique, estamos com o grande designer aqui, Malachi Ray Rempen. Did I say it correctly, Malachi?
Yeah.
First, we'd like to thank you for joining us. I hope you are fine.
Yes, I'm fine, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Zé Fernandes, the one who brought me the game to play first time, since I was trying to buy it, to purchase it import it from Brazil to Brazil, and then we had the great news that the game was coming, and now finally we are playing and people having a blast playing it. Really cool game.
That's great.
And but first, let us know a little bit about you. How long have you been playing board games?
I've played some board games as a kid, obviously. When I was, my dad is German, and so when I was a kid, we played these kind of odd German games, like kids games, really, family games, like Fang den Hut, and which is Trap the Cap in English, or Malefiz, or Mensch ärgere dich nicht. These like kind of brutal, abstract games for kids. And then I forgot that board games existed. I played a little bit of chess in middle school, but nothing competitive or anything. And then I was into filmmaking. I made films. That was my calling for many years. Hence the board game, the roll camera theme. And then I moved to Berlin in 2011. Met some friends there. They introduced me to modern board games by way of Pandemic Legacy, which was my season 1, which was my first modern board game experience. It was my first legacy game experience. It was my first cooperative game experience. So I didn't know. It was like my mind was completely blown. That was my entry into the hobby. And after that, I also have a webcomic called Itchy Feet, and I did a card game based on Itchy Feet. And that was kind of my first entry into making board games as well.
Wow, interesting. So you began with lots of mechanics and kind of games at the same time. So wow, very interesting. And when did you realize you were more than a gamer, than you were actually a game designer?
Yeah, so again, I hadn't been a gamer that long. I mean, a gamer in the hobby game sense. I had played Pandemic. I think we'd played a couple other games, like maybe Robinson Crusoe, or this group I had was very into cooperative games. So there was Robinson Crusoe, and we played, what was the other one? Mechs vs. Minions, another one. So like these co-op games. And I had this webcomic, as I mentioned, Itchy Feet, which is still running, and it's about travel and language learning and sort of living in foreign countries. And a friend of mine suggested I make a card game based on the comic. And I had seen the success around that time that Exploding Kittens had, which is also based on it's not based on a webcomic, but it's by the artist of a webcomic, and he kind of brought his audience to the game. And that was what I thought I could do as well. And I certainly didn't think I was going to raise millions of dollars, which I did not. But I thought, well, if he can do it for his like sizable audience, I can do it for my smaller audience, and I did. And that was me. That was Itchy Feet, the card game that came out in 2017, and I enlisted the help of. I knew I hadn't made any games before, and I needed help with it. So I talked to Maxime Rioux, who's a friend who was a reader of the comic. I basically put out a call on my comic and said, "Does anyone want to help me make a card game?" And this guy, Maxime, who's a Canadian, he was following my comic for a while, and he is a game designer in the mobile game space, and he wanted to try a card game. And so we worked on it together for a while. And then I honestly thought that was going to be the end of it for me. I thought I was going to release this little card game. It was going to maybe raise, if I was lucky, 10, 15 grand on Kickstarter, and I would have it as a piece of merchandise for my comic, and I would go about my business. And that would be the first and last time I ever used Kickstarter. And instead, the game raised $115,000, and I just thought, wow. In fact, it was my wife. She was like, "You would be stupid not to do another one." So like another project. So I thought, okay, maybe so. Maybe I could do a board game this time. What could I make a board game about? Well, there hasn't really been a board game about movie making, which, as I said, is my background. I went to film school. I worked in the film industry in Los Angeles for several years. I worked as a freelancer in Berlin for then many more years after that. I taught filmmaking. I even ran the film department of a college in Berlin. And I just, so I'm very, that was like my first love, was filmmaking. And but I saw that there wasn't really any movie making board games. There were some that were themed around Hollywood, broadly speaking, or that had like a studio level, like a competitive studios against each other type perspective, or they'd be like movie trivia games. But I wanted, like, my passion was always on set, like being on set in front of the cameras, or sorry, behind the cameras, setting up a shot, dealing with the pressures of all the various things that can go wrong during a film production. And I thought I could try to recreate that in a board game medium. And that's what I did with Roll Camera.
That's so cool. So cool. And
like I said, like, even when that came out, like, I wasn't really much of a gamer. So like a lot of people, I think, play games very intensively and then realize like, oh, I could actually make one and go about making it. For me, I was still very fresh to the hobby when I set about making it, which I think was an advantage because I wasn't precious about it. Number one, I never felt like, to be honest, like at the time anyway, I didn't appreciate board games as an art form, really. I just thought like, well, it's a game, it's a board game. And so I was able to let go of any pretensions about it. I was just like, well, it's just gonna be a game. It's gonna have these bits and pieces. I wanted it to be good and I wanted it to be fun, but I wasn't trying to make the next big hit. I was just like, well, it'll just be a board game about making movies. So that was able to, I think it was an advantage to be a bit of an outsider at the time. In helping me just bring it to life and not be so precious about it and not worry if it's gonna, because I wanted to make movies. I didn't want to make board games. Now it's flipped, but
yeah. So what a surprise! So you nail it. The game, right? It's a hit. It's a hit. Wow, pretty intense.
For me anyway. At my level, it was a hit. Everyone's been really enjoying it. Everyone saw it as kind of new and different. The theme was different. Which again, there are other movie making board games, but none that really capture quite that perspective that I was capturing. And I think its novelty comes from me not having any idea what the marketplace, no idea, but I don't have the like level of understanding I do now of sort of what are the trends, what do people like and not like, and I was ignorant of that to a large degree, and so I think that helped, actually.
Very nice, very nice. And one question we always like to ask the game designers, the authors of games, is about the process of creating a game. Do you start from the theme, from the mechanics, or a dream you had? Of course, you started from the background you have, right? But when creating, you have the process. How did you start working on it?
Yeah, I'm 100% a theme first designer. So Itchy Feet, based on my webcomic, that was theme first because it was trying to capture a travel game. Roll Camera was theme first, and the projects I'm working on now they're all theme first. And very often I will find myself during development breaking parts of the game that work perfectly well and pulling them out because it's not quite delivering the thematic experience that I want. I would rather have a game with some weird, funky rules and like unusual edge cases that captures a theme well than a game that is perfectly rounded off and sanded and is very elegant, but isn't about anything, doesn't have anything really to say. So for Itchy Feet and Roll Camera, certainly. And now that I'm getting more into it, I've had certain ideas on my like ideas list of like, oh, well, it could be, you could have a game where this was the mechanism, but not very many. For me, it's just not so interesting to start from a mechanism. It's about starting from a theme. And what I've learned is the next step after that, like if I know I have a game that I want to, or a theme that I want to make a game about, I got a long list of those, but the next step is the big one, which is what is the core mechanism going to be? What is the game going to what's the game part going to be, and that can take a really long time to find and to figure out. And I've made so many dead ends since designing roll camera. I've like, my resume of failed designs is very, very long, and I've learned a lot from that. But it comes from just not realizing how important that core mechanism was. And I got really lucky with roll camera that it came together very quickly, relatively to some of these other projects I'm working on. They're just taking forever because it just doesn't quite work in the same way that it did with roll camera, or maybe with roll camera I was more forgiving. I'm not sure, that's possible too. But that's generally the process. I start with an idea, then I look for a mechanism that would fit that idea. Once those two things connect, then I can start building on that. And I go into software or with pen and paper, and I'll sketch out what that might look like. What are the systems that add to that, and kind of express the theme through that core mechanism. And oftentimes the core mechanism is athematic, in meaning it doesn't meet the theme. I mean, if you think about roll camera, everyone says it's such a thematic game, it's such a thematic game. Well, the one thing that is the least thematic about it is rolling the dice to see what crew you get. Like, there's a lot of processes in place on a film set to ensure you don't get a random assortment of crew members on every given day, that you have exactly who you need, exactly when you need them. That's very important on a film set. So that part of it is random, but the theme, the reason it still feels thematic is that it's not about literally crew members showing up on set. It's more of an abstraction of the feeling of having resources spread thin. Like, you have a limited number of resources, you have a limited number of ways that you can use your crew. What's the best way of using the crew? So that comes out. I think it's possible to have abstraction in a sense that feels more thematic than a literal simulation of what actually happens, if that makes sense.
Do you play video games, or have you played before?
Yeah, so that gap that I was talking about, where between when I was a kid playing some board games and then an adult playing board games about a decade ago. During that gap, I played a lot of video games. I still play some video games, but not as many. I like that board games give you an opportunity to look away from your screens. That's why I don't really play app-based or games that have app integrated, because for me, the whole point is getting off my phone and getting away from screens and just interacting with people and with systems that are in front of you. But yeah, I've played lots of video games. I grew up on, like, a lot of my games that I loved were the Half-Life series from Valve, the Grand Theft Auto. I was playing back when it was Grand Theft Auto 3. I didn't play earlier than that, so I haven't played the top-down 2D ones. But yeah, those were like mainstays. Elder Scrolls, the original, the Morrowind, the original. Wow. That's not the original. I have played Daggerfall, and it's terrible, but Morrowind's really good. Yeah, so those were my main video game hunts. And then recently I've been getting more into indie video games. My brother, in the meantime, has become a video game designer himself. Cool. So he's a video game designer and publisher, also a self-publisher like me. And so through him, I've started playing a lot of really interesting indie games like Baba Is You or Noita. I've been playing. Yeah, so those interest me more now than they did when I was a kid.
I'll look for them.
Sorry, yeah, look for, Noita, Noita, that's a great one. And Baba Is You is also a great little puzzle game.
And I ask you that because I used to play lots of PC games mostly, and I love playing strategic simulation ones. But there's one I played the most, and the movies, which is a game I really love. I moved to this apartment now. I have to find it. I still have the CDs, the blue CDs cover, plus the expansion called Stunts, which is a game about movies. We are the producer, and we have the sets and the actors and everything and you have to prepare the movie to hire them. And when you're about to shoot, the actors have arguments and they have problems, and you have to solve the problems. But as you know, when you start playing board games, your will to play video games starts fading away, because you want to interact with other people, have friends, and your game brought exactly the need I had to play a movies game. That game that is, I still have the CDs. I don't play them anymore. I have it here. I have them here. And with the with your game Roll Camera, I start feeling the same, but playing with my friends. I don't know if you know that game.
I do. Yes, I did play this when I was a kid, actually, and it's funny because I forgot about it until the game was going up for Kickstarter, and Rado, from Rado Runs Through, Richard Ham he did the preview for the initial Kickstarter campaign, and in his final thoughts video, he was talking about this game, The Movies, which he worked on. He used to be a video game developer, and he worked on The Movies, the video game. And so he was a big fan of Roll Camera from the beginning because, again, it captured, like you're saying, this thing. And I had forgotten. I was like, oh, yes, of course. We played that game. You build up your little studio, your little lot. And so, of course, I played that a lot when I was a kid. I think when I was a kid, I remember, again, more like a teen, I was disappointed with that game a little bit in that I wanted the movies that you made to be more like real movies because I was interested in making movies. And so the movies, the game, it's much more like Roll Camera, where the movie you come out with doesn't really make sense and it's sort of nonsense. And in the game, it doesn't matter in both Roll Camera and the movies. It doesn't really matter what the movie you make is because the game plays around the making of the movie. But I remember as a kid, I was hoping for more of a simulation that would let me actually make movies where I didn't have to go get a crew together and get props and find places to shoot and get equipment and all this stuff. I could just do it in the game, but no, it's not that kind of game.
When you're shooting movie and you're placing the dice, and then sometimes you have to, okay, let's have a meeting here. Okay, and then I have a very nice, but is it good or not? No, mine is good. Mine is not so good. Okay, let's see. And then we put the first one here, the second one, and then we're going to use it now. Okay. It was not as good as we thought. Okay. The moment that you have on your left
storyboard,
the story, exactly. And then those cars will flip and come to the other side where you will start the story. But they are so funny because there were two brothers, and then one of them had a baby, and then the other one shoot the other. And that makes drama. And then you have the levels where it's going to be a great movie. It's going to be a great movie. And then suddenly something happens, and then, okay, it's going to be the bad one. Let's try to make it at least movies.
Oh, Ed Wood.
Let's make a Ed Wood movie then.
Yeah.
Oh, and it's lots of laugh, and it's a funny movie, but with tense moments.
Oh, thank you. And it's funny that you mentioned the movies, the video game, because it was made by this company, Lionhead Studios, which didn't stick around for very long, but they made another big game called Black and White, which was a sort of God simulator. Yes. And it's funny realizing now, because my next big game that I'm designing right now is going to be a little bit bigger than Roll Camera, is called Almighty. And it's like a God. It's about being sort of ancient God and the sort of the good and bad things that you do to gain power. And it's funny how that as well is another type of game made by Lionhead Studios, which again, you don't really see that anymore. You don't really, in video games, you don't see many God simulators, and in board games, you don't either. There are a lot of games that have ancient gods in them, that have Roman this and Greek that and Nordic so-and-so, but none of them are about you being the god from your perspective, looking down, making decisions that involve your particular people. They tend to be sort of these dry Euro games or war games. So that's my next, again, in my quest to keep making Lionhead Studio games into board games. It's continuing.
I will keep an eye on it. I will actually. I was having a look at it on BGG, and I think it's really interesting. When I was younger, I had a computer system called Commodore Amiga, and there was a game called Populous.
Yes.
Let's talk more about Almighty. What can we expect from the game? Do you have a date of release, deadline?
I'm going to release it next year, probably have a Kickstarter campaign late next year. That's the goal. But I'm very much a kind of designer and publisher where I'm not going to publish something that I don't think is good. So if it takes longer than that, then it will take longer than that. but that's my goal, because I've already been working on it for a year with a co-designer named Kevin Prival.
Okay.
And what can we expect? Well, it's competitive. It's not dice worker placement like roll camera. It's basically what I'm trying to capture with Almighty, in the way that roll camera, what my goal was to capture the feeling of being on set, shooting a film, and the decisions you have to make. My goal with Almighty is to capture the feeling of what it is to be a pantheon of gods. So basically you build up a pantheon of different gods of different things that can do different things and act in different ways. And then you have followers that are specific to you, and you impact them in order to gain resources. But things like power and belief, which is the currency, and souls. So like when they die, then their souls come into your underworld and they're worth points at the end, but you can spend them to do other things during the game. So I'm trying to capture the feeling of, it's funny because I used to love ancient mythology when I was a kid. It was another thing that, like, from my childhood, is just a big part of my childhood. I never read superhero comics. My superheroes were like Hercules and Perseus and these Greek heroes and Nordic god stories as well, and Egyptian. I was big into Egyptian mythology. So like ancient mythology was very, very big to me, and larger than life kind of fantasy stories in the way I thought of it. But the relationship that in those stories the people have to the gods is very odd. It's very oppressive, the way that these gods treat the people below them. They're very capricious and moody and like very human. They act in this way that is, they have a lot of grudges, and they hate each other and they love each other, and they treat people in the same way that like a 4-year-old treats a bug. Not the way an adult treats a bug, which, for me anyway, I'm much more careful around bugs now. I don't just smash things, creatures left and right, but a kid doesn't care. And that's kind of like the feeling of that I was trying to capture, is like the feeling of being an ancient god as the ancient god was imagined by people in ancient times, which is like just a horrifying active like force of nature, basically. So that's the feeling. And the funny thing about Almighty is, initially it started out as a kind of area control game where your followers were pieces moving around, and you were in these different lands. And what I realized was in order to be interesting, you needed some randomness. But what is randomness to a god? Randomness to a mortal is very easy to understand, because we understand it every day, which is why in roll camera, the randomness of the problems that come up, or the randomness of the ideas that you have, or the randomness of the dice that you roll, it makes sense, because that's the randomness we encounter anytime we try to do anything of any size, any project of any size. We encounter random problems. The universe just gets in your way, right?
Yeah.
If you're a god, you are the randomness. You decide what the randomness is. So like, it didn't really make sense to have dice and to have random draws and in the same way when you are a god, because you have that power. Like the legal term, act of God. If you are that god, you're deciding.
Makes
sense.
Like,
what's the randomness then? And so it evolved into more of a Euro game, which usually I find less thematic. Like most Euro games, I think are not so thematic. But in this case, it felt more thematic, because you have way more control as a god than you do as like a farmer in your usual Euro game. Like if you're playing a Euro game as a farmer, like, is there any profession that is more subject to random acts of God than being a farmer? But in most Euro games, you have much more perfect control over like your situation, your resources, your gains, your losses. So I think actually playing as a god makes more sense as a Euro game than it does as like a war game, or more of a game with more randomness. Whereas I think a lot of Euro games, actually, the reason they feel athematic is because you have too much control. You have too much perfect information.
Yeah.
Most so that's of them. I don't know if that answers your question about all my random stuff, but
and I was thinking about that. As you start explaining, it makes totally sense.
Yeah, and and where the randomness comes in is the free will of people, right? And this is something I've been struggling to capture in the game. At the moment, it's represented by when you gain followers, you don't, unlike most games where you get to like draw two and pick one, or pick from a marketplace or a display, they're random from a deck. And that does feel accurate, because it's like, you don't have control over who's going to follow you, you know, as a god. That's the one thing you don't have control over, because humans, at least in the world of Almighty, have free will. They can decide whether they follow you or not, and that is out of your control. Everything else is in your control, that when the lightning strikes, and when the floods happen, and when the desert blooms, and when the clouds shape into weird shapes, like that's all in your control, but you don't control who follows you specifically. So that has been kind of fun to think about.
Zé Fernandes, he has some questions for you. In Roll Camera, you worked as a designer and illustrator and arts of the game. Which of those roles did you like the most?
You mean designer or illustrator? Because I was also a publisher. I guess that's
the publisher. Oh my God,
big role. I mean, I always liked art. Roll Camera was tricky for me to do the art for, because I'm not a classically trained artist. So like, I don't have any formal background in like illustration. And so for my webcomic, like, especially if you go back and look at what it looked like way back at the beginning, like everything I know about drawing, I've taught myself pretty much. And that was tricky. That was fine for Itchy Feet, because Itchy Feet was meant to only go out to my webcomic audience. And so it has a very loose style that's very, not unprofessional, but it just, I don't know that it would hold up as well today as it did 5 years ago. And Roll Camera, because I can't really draw in like a realistic style. I can really only draw in a cartoony style. I had no choice but to draw it in the way that I did. And so it was tricky to come up with a way, especially for the graphic design, which is very different than illustration. So I guess the illustration, like the scene cards, that wasn't so hard, because I've done lots of comics and cartoons, and it's basically like doing panels in a cartoon. But the rest of it, like the layout, how does the editing room look? How does the storyboard look? The to-do list for ideas, like where does this layout, like how realistically do I render that? And what does the middle part look like with all the little people like running around? I tried lots of different versions of that, and they all seemed too busy, or they got in the way. So it's very tricky to do board game art, board game graphic design, which is different, like the graphic elements on the table or on cards, because they have to stay out of your way as a player, but still feel like present and part of the game at the same time. And there are parts of Roll Camera I don't think I succeeded on, or that I could do better. But yeah, that part was definitely a challenge. And I liked being the designer, because it was new for me. It was a very new thing to design a game at that time, and I didn't know what I didn't know, and I didn't know that it could be really hard, because it wasn't so hard to do Roll Camera. At least my memory of it wasn't so hard. Whereas now I feel like I'm banging my head against designs day in, day out, and I find it really difficult now. And I'm happy to work with other people to design now and in the future. I'm glad I did it for Roll Camera, and I'm glad I made it start to finish by myself, more or less. But yeah, that one is becoming more tricky. And then publishing, I think for a lot of designers, and certainly a lot of even designer illustrators, that's the hardest part, because publishing is project management at a very large scale compared to what most people do in their day-to-day life. It has to do with pipelines and timelines that are very, very long, sometimes a year or more. They have to do with workflows that make sure that things are in place when they need to be, so there's no bottlenecks in the production and the delivery, not to mention budgeting, scheduling, taxes, engaging with multiple parties, the factory, the freight company, the Facebook advertising. Like, that's all a lot for a lot of people. For me, coming from filmmaking, it was super easy. I mean, not the easiest thing in the world, but like, honestly, like the scale and pressure involved in making a film, it is 10, 20, 100 times what making a board game is. The stuff that you have to deal with in making a board game it's the same. You still need to, like I said, like the structure of it is very similar. Delivering the product is very, there are similarities, but like in film, you're dealing with tens of thousands of dollars on a very low budget, maybe hundreds of thousands or millions even of dollars of budget that you're at stake. Not to mention like reputations of people. You have hundreds of people on the production. Like the amount of technical knowledge you have to have is very, very high at every different level, at every different stage of production. It's just, it's a lot. And so for me, making this board game, it felt like I was doing an easy mode project. And so that I think has helped a lot for me as well, that like my background in filmmaking has helped me get this, like be able to put together a large project with multiple different facets and pieces and all these moving parts. And I enjoy it. I like it.
You said about easy mode.
Yeah.
How is to balance the level of difficulty in a co-op game in order to make it not so difficult, but also not so easy?
It's really tough. And Roll Camera is a funny example of that too, because sometimes people will say, this game is super hard. This is like one of the hardest games we've ever played. Rado said this. He's like, it's really, really challenging, really, really hard game. And then I get other people who are like, this game is too easy, even on the hard mode, and we have to like add restrictions to ourselves to make it fun. So that's a great question, how you balance for a co-op. I'm not sure I know the answer. All I know is that the majority of people who have played Roll Camera that I have seen play that anyway have had a good time, and that's kind of all that matters. I think balance is actually, I'll say this. I think balance is an illusion. At least in Roll Camera it is. It looks like it's tuned very specifically. It has all of these particular points of quality on the track. It has like numbers on the schedule and budget. On the back side of the dials, you can set your difficulty level. But the honest truth of it is, like, I didn't extensively test every single iteration and like every combination of all of these numbers and every possible difficulty level, because a lot of it also comes down to who's the group. Are you, is the group getting engaged with the puzzle? Are they finding that really difficult? Well, then it becomes harder. Or do the ideas, like, do you see how the idea can work 3 stages ahead of time? Or are you just looking at how it works right now? So like, it's really hard to balance for that. So the balance in Roll Camera, and I think in a lot of games, is basically more just 2 ends of a spectrum, where you want to avoid the bottom end being, like you said, too difficult, where it's just impossible. And that's pretty easy to figure out where that is, because the game breaks basically. And so you make it like whatever you did to do that, you do that a little bit less. And then the top end, where it's just way too easy, where it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to win. Obviously that's also broken. So you just bring it in a little bit there. And then somewhere in the middle, any numbers in the middle are made up. They don't correspond. There's no algorithm that I've created that says like, in this difficulty, 3.5 is like this much more difficult than 2.7 or whatever. Okay. It's not like that. It's just sort of, it's put in there. Yeah, it's an approximation, which I think is fine. But I think a lot of people get lost in the math of it, and I do sometimes too. But the honest truth is, usually doesn't matter if people are having a good time.
Roll Camera has expansions too.
Yes.
For now we have only the basic here. I think there will be. I hope they come to Brazil really soon. Plans for the future. What are your plans for the future? What can you tell us about? We have the Almighty coming.
Yeah, Almighty is like another big game that's going to be heavier than Roll Camera and a larger game. It's very ambitious for me personally anyway. But before Almighty comes out, there's a game from another designer called Power Vacuum, which is a trick-taking game. It's a smaller game, lighter than Roll Camera, and that's going to hopefully launch in the spring. And the concept behind Power Vacuum is this is a world of anthropomorphic appliances. So there's like a toast. One player is a toaster person, one player is like an iron, one person is a radio. So like there are these appliances, right? But it's in an authoritarian government, and the leader has died. The leader was a vacuum cleaner. So the power vacuum is the term meaning like when a leader is taken away, then who comes in to fill that spot. So you are all playing as ministers in this like household appliance government trying to take over after the vacuum cleaner dies. And so it's a trick-taking game of being like sneaky and conspiracies and spycraft, and it's very, very neat. It was a game that, again, I came up with the theme first. Like I had the title and the theme before I had anything else, and I also wanted to capture the feeling of like if you've seen the film The Death of Stalin or the Dark Crystal from the 80s, the Muppet, the Jim Henson movie, where both of these films, but like both of them involve a leader who dies, and then the ministers and like the advisors to the leader trying to battle between each other to be the next one to fill the slot. And I wanted to capture the feeling of like temporary allies, temporary enemies. Hey, come here, let's work together against them, and then now you're my enemy again, and like capture this feeling of like shifting allegiances, which I didn't know, but a trick-taking game actually works really well with. So this friend of mine named Caleb Wenzel-Fisher designed the game, came to me one day and he was like, I've got Power Vacuum, I've got it. And he did, and it worked really great. And so we've been fast tracking that while Almighty is still cooking in the oven. I'm gonna be able to release this one next. So that's the next game that's gonna come out. Then Almighty, and then I don't know, then I'll probably return to the movie theme in some way. I have some ideas for, I've been supporting Roll Camera with these like micro expansions called story packs, and I'll probably continue to do that ongoingly. But I don't know, I kind of want to get back to the film theme somehow, and I'm not sure how maybe I'll do like a sequel to Roll Camera that involves a different part of the filmmaking process, like post-production or acting or directing, or I'm not sure. Maybe it will be like Roll Camera, but for a different creative industry, like a band trying to record an album or a theater production or something like that. I'm not sure, but I have a feeling I'm going to return to this theme somehow.
One more question, just because you told me about your games have a kind of comedy sketches and moments. Mm-hmm. And the question was, do you have in mind to make another game in a more kind of serious tone?
That's a great question. I do have ideas for games that are varying levels of serious. For example, I've always loved Venice. My wife is from Venice, the city in Italy, and I've always loved that. It's my favorite city in the world. It's such a weird, cool museum of a city. And the way it was built was really interesting. And I thought it could be, if I ever did a history game, it would be based on how Venice was constructed, and like players, just the history of that is just fascinating. But you're right that like most of my games have a kind of comedic angle, you know, Power Vacuum, Almighty, Roll Camera, Itchy Feet, and most of the ideas on my list there's a joke involved, there's a laugh in there somewhere. Yeah. And this Venice game, like I just can't think of like what's funny about it. It's not really a funny thing. And so I have to decide for myself, for my brand, King Bean Studio, like, do I always have to make funny games, or can I try one that's not funny? I don't know yet. Maybe I can, maybe I will, I'm not sure. And I think honestly, that's one thing I can do that a lot of other publishers can't do, is humor in a way that is actually genuinely funny. A lot of humor in games usually tends to be very obvious or very lowbrow or very cheesy or not very funny. And I think I've had some success putting humor into my games so far that is a type of humor people don't usually see. And so it may be a bad idea to try to do a not funny game, because it's kind of the thing I can do. Anyone can make a Venice building game. There are lots of publishers that can make a game about building Venice. I don't have to be that one. So yeah, it's good to get that feedback. Thank you, because it is important for me to figure out, like, is this my thing? Do I have to stick to that? And we'll see.
But we'll be waiting now that you mentioned the Venice.
We'll see.
Who knows? Really, really anxious. Mr. Malachi, we'd like to thank you very much, Zé Fernandes and I, for your time, for being with us.
Yeah, thank you. Feel free to send me the link when it is done, and I'll share it also on my channels.
Oh, thank you. I will.
No problem. All right. Thanks, Rodrigo.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.